Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Tammie Cumming. I'm the Associate Provost for Institutional Effectiveness at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. And today we're going to be talking about AAQEP and assessment in accreditation.
Thank you, Tammie. I'm David Miller, co-host, and I am actually a professor in research and evaluation methods at the University of Florida. I'm also the school director for the School of Human Development and Organizational Studies in Education. And I'm very pleased today to have with us our guest, Mark LaCelle-Peterson, who is the founding team member and president of the Association for Advancement Quality in Educator Preparation, or AAQEP. Okay, and what I wanted to start with today, Mark, was just a very simple notion. I know that you are the founding member of AAQEP, and you started this new organization, and we'd like to just start with a basic, why did you make a decision to start this new organization?
Well, thank you. First of all, pleasure to be here. So thanks for having me. The decision to start the new organization was actually a widespread one. There was a desire, particularly in New York State, although not exclusively in New York State, to come up with a different approach to doing accreditation of educator preparation programs, one with some standards that were grounded in the field and a little bit less connected to federal compliance requirement standards, and with a little different ethos and engagement, sort of emphasizing the peer review side of accreditation more than was the case at the time. So in 2017, there was a strong push to do it, and some of us had the opportunity to get together with colleagues in New York and say, is there enough support that we can go ahead and do this and have support from the state as well as from the institutions? And the answer was in the affirmative. So we went ahead and in the summer of 2017 launched a new agency.
That's wonderful. I was mentioning to David that a colleague of mine from Brooklyn, who's the assessment manager, and I went over to Columbia University Teachers College, which was hosting an accreditation event with AAQEP, and that's when we became familiar with your accreditation organization. We were really impressed with the work that you're doing, with the thought that was put into the standards. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the differences between AAQEP and other teacher education accreditation organizations.
Sure. And I think the standards might be a good place to start. So first, just a little bit on process. In the fall of 2017, before anybody else even knew what Zoom was, we were Zooming with people from University of Manoa in University of Hawaii at Manoa, so in Honolulu, all the way to New York City, and from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan down to the bottom of Texas, to the tip of Texas, to discuss the standards for the field, to discuss the process that institutions would benefit from, and to discuss ways of ensuring consistency. So we got our start in that way, and if there's a novelty in our approach to standards, I think it's this. I think we found a way to address and perhaps even to solve one of the persistent problems in accreditation, namely that accreditation, if you don't treat it carefully, becomes a ceiling on progress. If you can't go outside the boxes of the definitions of the standards, you end up locking things in place in a way that's not helpful. So one thing that sets us apart is that our standards include two things, both foundational expectations that are the same and operationalized more or less the same everywhere, but also a recognition of context in our two contextual challenge or innovation-oriented standards. So in a sense, that means we recognize both that educator preparation is a long-established field with a strong research base, with lots of wisdom of practice, and things that we know matter in terms of what we need to see in candidate performance and also in what we need to see in program practices. But we also recognize that we're a dynamic, growing and changing field with ongoing development that needs to be recognized and where we need to have room for that development to take place. So I think our standards do a nice job of both assuring quality on the common things that we all need to be doing, but also allowing Brooklyn College to express itself and to confidently address the specific needs of the constituencies that are most important to you, and would also allow the University of Florida to do the same in your very different contexts and everywhere in between and across the country.
Okay, that's interesting. One of the other things that we've noted is it seems like AAQEP has a a strong emphasis on validity, reliability, and fairness. And as someone who really, my background is mostly in assessment, and so I'm very pleased to see that. But I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about how you why the importance, or how the importance gets operationalized there in AAQEP of those key measurement kinds of properties.
Sure. I think maybe a place to start is to say we have a little bit of a dilemma around evidence in educator preparation. There's some stuff that we collect that might be valuable. It might be largely administrative, might be of interest just to us. It's important nonetheless. But I think we need a robust conversation around what are the types of evidence that could actually give us confidence to really accomplish the fundamental goal of accreditation, which is quality assurance. And that means somebody has to be assured about some qualities that you can actually identify. And you know, that operates at a lot of different levels. Our state authorizers might be satisfied that there's quality when you see license exam results are above a certain threshold. That's important. But what's going to actually assure our local partners in the schools that we have the qualities that they need? And so we emphasize a couple of things in our quality assurance work that might seem a little odd, unless you start from the perspective of the program evaluation research standards, which of course program evaluation research is one of the families of complementary methods within the AERA framework or family of methods. And so we start our work focusing on the need for local confidence in measures, for consequential validity in the sense that you need to be able to actually make inferences that you want to make. And if your evidence is supposed to give the inference that this is valid proof that someone can be an effective teacher if I hire them, you kind of need the people who are going to do the hiring and who are in the classroom helping with the preparation to be engaged in that process. So we work within the traditional vocabulary of data quality, looking at validity, but we want to make sure that that validity includes connection with those who need to understand the evidence in order to make inferences from it. So we put a big emphasis on stakeholder engagement in the development of measures, or at least in the review of measures, or in the understanding of the evidence that comes out of them. Similarly with reliability, who is it that where there needs to be the calibration and the consistency? Well, you need to have engagement with local partners so that the cooperating teacher and the supervisor that are making evaluations of candidates are in the same place and doing it. And we also include fairness or equity as a lens for that, because our view is if the data is not accurate, it can't be fair, especially if it's not accurate in a certain direction for certain populations. And if it's not, and if it's fair, it's more likely to be accurate. So we're still developing this framework to say how can we ensure that the data is of good quality, but of good quality that's recognized and actually valuable and actionable to people at different points of contact with the program. I'm not sure if that made sense. So maybe you've got some other follow-up questions on that line.
I think that makes some good sense here. The one thing that I sort of have as a follow-up here is it seems to me that the work I've done in particularly in validity, but also in fairness, is that everybody's defining these things a little bit different, or they may emphasize different components of fairness. Or I know that the standards talk about 5 different types of evidence that we might look at. You seem to have landed a little bit on consequences. Is that require a lot of training within AAQEP, or are people really ready for that? I find that fascinating to think of it as the emphasis on consequences, because that's sort of the newest of the 5 types of evidence that are out there.
It is,
I know
yeah.
that most people are ready for that. That's interesting.
Well, you have to start somewhere is the thing. And so we'll take the example of an evaluation, some kind of an evaluation of a candidate during their final performance. Okay. Now, if we're looking at ensuring the consequences a long ways into the future, that's going to be a long time coming. But we can get closer to it by saying, if we take a look at the content and say, yep, the state standards are really there, the candidates really been prepared and ready to teach them. They've shown evidence that they're able to do certain things. But you know what? Even when we set that up, let's get some partners to come in, some of our P12 partners to come in and help us define what that is and say, are we all on the same page? We're all looking at this performance. We're all trying to decide, is this person ready to move into responsibility as an effective teacher? Let's come together and talk about what we mean by that. And then after we've gathered some evidence, let's come together and look at that evidence and so, okay, how does this help us understand it? And then let's talk about how we're going to evaluate that and rate it. And so, you know, David, there's a need for ongoing attention and for looking at some, why am I blanking on the term now? Well, the longitudinal data that it's going to tell us in the long run, how did that work out? And that'll still be a long time coming, but we think we can get people started on the right path in the short run. And then continue to develop it. So I can't claim we've got consequential validity nailed. And again, we're approaching it chiefly from a program evaluation research standpoint that says you got to have your stakeholders involved in understanding it. You've got to look pragmatically at what's going to be useful for you in the local context. So there's some, of course, some much finer grained and deeper psychometric work that remains to be done. But for on the ground work, actually getting people started, and to borrow Deb Ball's framing, to agree and say we've got a good bead on whether this is a well-begun beginner, I think we can at least get that far, and then keep digging deeper and trying to you know, build larger data sets. And there are folks out there in the research community that are working on that in a bigger and deeper way, and you know, we sure want to support that too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an important conversation. Before we leave, though, do you have any words of advice? Because there are lots of different professional accreditation organizations out there, and some really are showing us the best practices. What would the takeaway be? Let's say you're with a professional organization that doesn't have assessment written into the standards. What's the takeaway? Why should they care? What should inspire them to consider that as part of this important work?
I think our assessment work, especially if you're working in a clinical field, so I'll sort of start there because there are lots of clinical accreditors that are out there. Be aware of the research work that's going on in accreditation. Well, actually, let me back up a second and say there are a lot of off-the-shelf measures that you can get, but I always tell people you actually can't buy validity. You can't buy reliability. You can only enact them. And so you'll do right by yourself if you do two things. One, if you take a look at the instruments that are there, the measures that are there, understand how they've been, how their validity has been studied, understand what mechanisms they have for reliability, but always realize you have to do that work yourself because you can't buy it. And at the same time, don't look away from your locally developed measures as if they're not going to be useful to you, because since you have to enact the validity, you might as well enact it with something you developed and designed yourself. I think we need a balance of those things. We need some things that are widely available and common, and there's beautiful work going on in development of assessments and measures in a lot of different areas. But in the end, it always comes down to how are you using the instrument locally? How are you using it with your partners? How are you ensuring that those who are looking at the evidence understand it in a common way and in a way that makes sense in the context in relation to the purposes and goals? So the fundamentals of assessment to me are always at the root, and you always have to go back to that. What's the purpose? Who's going to use the information? What does the information look like? How do we make sure we have common understanding? Because at heart, I think that every conversation about assessment is really a conversation about learning.
Absolutely.
I think that's fascinating. I like the ideas of the local assessments also may be giving good answers at times, and just the fact that they're local doesn't necessarily mean they're poor. In fact, it reminds me of once when I was in a court case and they asked me whether or not an instrument was valid for a particular use. And I remember it was a locally developed instrument, and my answer really had to be more along the lines of, we don't know. They haven't treated it seriously enough yet to look at the validity properties of it, to really learn that. And so I'm glad to see that you're engaged in that kind of work here. It seems like you're moving us along in a very good direction here.
Well,
Thank you.
Words of wisdom from Mark LaCelle-Peterson from AAQEP. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.